Hello and welcome, everyone. We are so excited to be here with you today. I'm Marisa Kraus with Polar Bears International. We're excited to reconnect with the Flipgrid team and share our love of polar bears with all of you today. We have two incredible experts who will introduce shortly, who will share their knowledge and their stories with you. And during today's event, we'll share our favorite polar bear fun facts and answer as many of your questions as possible. We want to encourage you to share where you're from and where you're tuning in from, and to take pictures throughout. And always, as always, ask an adult for permission to share them with us on Twitter or Facebook. We'll chat for about 45 minutes, and you can submit your questions for us in the chat window, and we'll do our best to answer them. Let's see here. Okay, so today we're going to start by introducing our guests, but we also have a few team members that you can't see behind the scenes. Elisa, Emma, and KT are helping to run the tech and helping to get your questions to us today. So joining me today are Tia and Wes, and we'll start by Tia, if you could please introduce yourself, and then pass it over to Wes as well.
Sure. So my name is Tia Beckshoft, and I'm a scientist with Polar Bears International. I've been doing polar bear research and outreach for the past 15 years or so, and I've been lucky enough to meet polar bears in the wild in Svalbard, in Greenland, in Russia, and in Canada.
Great. Do you want me to go next?
Sure. Over to you.
Wes.
Perfect. My name is Wes Larson. I also have worked with Polar Bears International on a number of projects. The main one being on the North Slope of Alaska, where we were looking at denning moms and their cubs. And I did that project for about 7 or 8 years with Polar Bears International. And also got to go up to Churchill and be on the Tundra buggy and see a bunch of bears up there and help with the Tundra Connections project.
Thank you, Wes. Thank you both of you for joining us today. I thought perhaps, Tia, if you might explain what's special about our connection today. Why are we here? What's special about this week? What's especially special about tomorrow with International Polar Bear Day?
Right. So International Polar Bear Day is something that we celebrate every year on February 27 and during the week leading up to it. So every year we use this day to raise attention on the need to take action. And this year, our focus is on the most vulnerable of the polar bears, that is the moms and the cubs, the new polar bear families, because right now we have polar bear moms and their newborn cubs snuggled together in snow dens all across the Arctic. And denning is, as I'm sure we'll talk more about, in this webcast, is a really vulnerable time in a polar bear's life, especially in the warming Arctic. And so, we want to make people aware that the survival of every single cub is critically important. And that's why this year we're focusing our celebration on how we can protect these valuable, vulnerable families in their den and, keeping them safe.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tia. Now that we know why we're all here and what's special about International Polar Bear Day, let's get started talking about what all of you want to know about polar bears. So we're going to start it off with Mrs. Pavanka's third grade class in Virginia in the United States. And they would like to know, do polar bears in zoos eat seal meat, or do they eat other things too?
So go right ahead, Wes.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure who that was for. Yeah, in zoos, they typically don't eat seal meat. A lot of times in zoos, they're going to feed them fish or other types of food that are a little bit easier to come by than seal meat. And, in a zoo, they don't have the same kind of environmental conditions that they have to survive in the wild. They're not dealing with really frigid temperatures. They're not dealing with having to travel really great distances in between feeding opportunities. So they don't need that really high caloric kind of meal that seal blubber gives them. And so something like fish or meat or something that is a little bit easier to come by, it's not quite as, it doesn't pack quite the same punch that seal blubber is going to pack. but it's going to be plenty for them in a zoo.
Thank you, Wes. So Miss Pivanka's third grade class is also wondering, while polar bears in the wild rely on the sea ice for everything they need to survive, in terms of survival, do polar bears have predators?
You know what? In the wild, they don't really have any predators. They compete with other polar bears, and sometimes big male polar bears will predate on cubs or on moms. And that's pretty rare, but as things get harder and harder for polar bears, we are seeing a little bit more of that. And then, you know, there is the slight chance that as things get warmer in the Arctic, that as orcas move in, they could actually kill polar bears as they're swimming. But that's not something we've seen, and we don't really know if that's going to happen. And then there are other predators, us as humans. We're the only thing that really actively goes out and hunts polar bears, unfortunately.
Thanks, Wes. That really leads us into our next question from a group of third graders in Abrams, Wisconsin. And if polar bears, you know, don't have as many natural predators, they'd like to know, are polar bears endangered? And I'm hoping, Tia, maybe you can elaborate on that for us.
Sure. So polar bears really are on top of the whole food chain in the high Arctic, but they are threatened nevertheless. They're quite vulnerable because if a polar bear could choose, it would be out on the sea ice 24/7 all year round. It would never set paw on land. And I'm sure you've all heard of climate change and how that's diminishing the extent of the Arctic sea ice. And unfortunately, polar bears need sea ice. Polar bears are really good swimmers. They're strong swimmers, but they're not very fast. So they cannot catch their prey, the seals, in the water. They need this platform of sea ice to be able to hunt and, you know, get their food. So if you don't have any sea ice, you're not going to have any polar bears. So because of climate change, yes, unfortunately, polar bears, they are quite vulnerable in the situation that we're in at the moment.
Thank you, Tia. And I think that actually leads into a nice place where KT in the background, if you're able to share this graphic for us, Tia mentioned climate change as the single biggest threat to polar bears. And we know that gases in the atmosphere act like a blanket, trapping heat around our Earth. And when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, we pump extra carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And that thickens the blanket and disrupts our global climate. And just as a hot summer day melts ice in your glass of water, a warming planet melts Arctic sea ice as well. And so that, I think, nicely leads into a question that we have from Mrs. Capizano's class. And talking about individual bears, they would like to know how long polar bears live.
Tia, do you want to do that one? Or
Sure.
Yeah.
So it depends on whether you're talking about polar bears in the wild or polar bears in the zoo. Because in the wild, there's no one to take care of the bears, you know, when they get old and sick and, you know. So in the wild, polar bears will typically, you know, they'll be in their early 20s, mid 20s. Whereas in the zoo, the oldest polar bear that we know of, she was in a Canadian zoo and she actually got to the ripe old age of 42, right? So they can get older, but in the wild, they usually don't.
That's interesting. Thank you for sharing that, Tia. So let's talk about, for a minute, we're going to switch gears to some different adaptations that polar bears have to help them survive in the wild. And we've got a question from Mrs. Capizano's class again. Do polar bears shed? And so if one of you could answer that question and then also talk about a polar bear's fur.
Sure, I'll grab that one. I've been working with polar bear fur quite a bit. So yeah, sorry, what was the first bit of the question?
Do polar bears shed?
Oh, do they shed? Right. Okay. So yes, polar bears absolutely have a thicker fur coat during the cold winter months. They will shed over the summer months into late fall, which makes sense because that's where it's warmest where they live, right? We don't have any, I can't unfortunately say more specifically than that because we don't have any research just yet that can tell us exactly when these things happen. But polar bear fur is amazing. It's made up of 2 different kinds of hair. So we have what we call the underfur or the woolen coat underneath. And the hairs there are they're approximately 1 thumb long. And they're kind of soft and a little bit curly, and they're really good at, holding on to heat, making this blanket around the body. So it's like if you put on a nice woolen sweater, right? And then on top of that, you have the second kind of hairs, which are called the guard hairs. And so guard hairs, they're about 2 thumbs long. So that would be yay long. They're about 2 thumbs long, and they're straighter, they're more wiry, and they kind of lie on top of the woolen coat, of the undercoat, and they protect it just like you would protect your woolen sweater against rain and wind with a wind jacket, right? So yeah, they're really good at staying warm in the high Arctic.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that polar bears really have 2 layers of fur, and then that they also have that thick padding of fat that helps to keep them warm. And so I'm hoping that also answers Mrs. Smith's 2nd grade question, do polar bears get cold? And okay, so here's another interesting question. Miss Doyle's class, her 4th grade class, would like to know, are polar bear skin really jet black, or are people just using Photoshop?
No, they actually do have black skin. Yeah, that's a true thing.
And do we know, is there a reason that they have black skin?
You know what? Tia is probably one of the best experts when it comes to polar bear anatomy, so I'll let her field that. But,
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can live up to it, but I'll try.
Oh, you can. Yeah.
So the thing is actually that when polar bears are born, they have pink skin. But before they leave this the snow den with their mom, which they do when they're about 3 months old, their skin goes from pink to black. And this black skin, you can find a polar bear, and shave it, but that's not too easy for most of us, right? So you can also see the black skin around the eyes, around the lips, and underneath the foot pads. And we think that the reason why that this black skin is important, it could be related to the sun in 2 different ways. One is that black is really good at absorbing heat. So, that would mean that it was easier for the bear to hold on to as much of the sun's heating rays as it could. But, half of the year in some places where polar bears live, it's actually dark 24 hours a day. And so, that wouldn't really help it much. So who knows? It could also be that the black is actually this higher concentration of melanin, it's called, which is what gives it the dark color, that is helping protect the polar bear against the sun's harmful UV rays. So, I mean, yeah, we don't actually know, but those are 2 of the theories, and they would kind of explain why polar bears, why it's important for them, for their skin to turn black before they leave that snow cave and go out into the Arctic spring with all the sunlight that entails.
One of the many reasons polar bears are crazy cool.
Yes.
So right now we have students tuning in from Harlem, New York, and from Nottingham, England, and Ontario, Canada, Virginia, Seattle, Washington. And so we've got students all over the world right now. Some of us are, just waking up and eating breakfast. Some of us are preparing to eat dinner and go to bed for the night. And we have some students in Harlem who are wondering, what do polar bears do at night? And are their routines sort of similar to humans? Do they sleep for 8 hours a day? Or what does that look like for a polar bear?
Yeah, those are great questions. Polar bears do have a similar sleep schedule in that the amount of time that they sleep during the day is very similar to humans. You typically see them sleeping for about 7 to 8 hours a day. But that doesn't necessarily need to be at a specific time of the day. Like most humans are going to sleep during the night. And depending on the time of year, polar bears may be sleeping during the day, they may be sleeping during the night, they may be hunting at night. They don't have necessarily a set schedule. And as Tia mentioned in one of the previous questions, night and day are kind of abstract concepts when it comes to the Arctic, because there are months where it's just complete sunshine all the time. The sun never goes down, and you have this constant daytime. And then there's months where you have a constant night as well. And so obviously during those times, polar bears are going to be active both during the day and then, and they're going to be sleeping during the day, and they're going to be active during the night and sleeping during the night. So their schedules are very variable, but they do tend to sleep about 7 or 8 hours a day.
Thanks, Wes. That's really interesting. You guys are both really great at chiming in on these different aspects of polar bear ecology and these different questions. And so I'm going to pivot a bit here to Mrs. Yaz's 4th and 5th graders. And they want to know what inspired you to study polar bears, and how do you feel when you go to freezing places to study these animals too?
I will start out with that. So first of all, I absolutely love being in the cold. Yeah, it makes me happy to my very core. At least if I have the clothes, right, that are appropriate for it. Because when it's cold, it's like you're so present. You don't have a choice. You have to be present. You have to be cognizant of what's happening around you, what you're doing. And I really, really enjoy that. As for how did I end up studying polar bears? It's all about who I met at what point in my life. To be honest, it was all a little bit of a coincidence. I was studying at a university center that is located in Svalbard, which is in polar bear country. And I was looking for a good master's project. I was looking for a good project to write during my university years. And someone pointed me to a professor who happened to have 800 polar bear skulls that he wanted someone to look at. So I ended up doing that, and that led to just more and more polar bears down the road, and here we are.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and pretty similar to my own, aside from the loving the cold part. I totally agree with Tia that the cold is so invigorating and it makes you feel alive, and you really do have to be so present, because we're working in temperatures where if you aren't present and if you aren't careful, you could really have some crazy things happen, and you can even die from those kind of temperatures. And as she mentioned, we have really good gear. I've got my parka here that we wear when we're up in the north, and it keeps you pretty warm. It's almost like an artificial polar bear fur layer and blubber layer. But as far as how I got started in polar bear biology, it's very similar to Tia's story. I met a professor that was doing the kind of work that I wanted to do. He was working with different bear species, and he was working on a polar bear project. He introduced me to the people at PBI, and that's kind of how that whole process got started. But I had always been just really fascinated with bears. I grew up in Montana, which is a state that has a lot of bears, and whenever I was out in the woods, just knowing that there was bears in the woods and bears that could potentially, really ruin my day and make things a lot more interesting when I'm out there, led me to kind of have this fascination with them. And it led those hikes to be much more invigorating and kind of exciting. When you're in the woods with bears, or if you're out on the tundra with bears, you have to pay attention to your surroundings, and things become much more vibrant and alive. And that kind of feeling is what inspired me to care about those animals, and then decide to pursue a career in conserving those kind of animals as well.
Thank you, both of you. And thanks for pointing out some of the ways that we adapt to colder weather to stay warm in the absence of some of these amazing adaptations that polar bears have developed for dealing with frigid Arctic weather. And on that note, we'll switch gears to warmer temperatures. We have students in Pennsylvania who would like to know, could polar bears survive in warm temperatures? And are they able to adapt to their surroundings?
Yeah, I think this might be a good question for maybe both of us can answer a little bit of this, but I think as far as can they survive in warmer temperatures, they have the ability, there's nothing within their body that makes that impossible. The problem is that the food source that they're so attached to, the food source that they hunt are these seals, and the seals use the sea ice to survive, and they really depend on the sea ice to survive, and therefore the polar bears do as well. So when it gets too warm, the polar bears don't have seals that they can hunt anymore, and it makes it impossible for them to survive because that's the food source that they're used to hunting. And so they brought up that question of can they adapt? And adaptation is kind of like it's a thing that a single animal or a single population of animals can do to make things a little bit easier on themselves. And adaptations can happen somewhat rapidly. But what takes a really long time to happen is evolution. And for all of the polar bears in the world to suddenly start using a different food source or figuring out how to live in a warmer climate, that sort of change takes millions of years. And unfortunately, we're not giving polar bears that amount of time to make that change. So that's why they can't just simply adapt to a new food source.
Yeah, no, I agree, Wes. I just want to add that, if you do see a polar bear in the wild or at the zoo, sometimes you'll see, one of the ways that they can behaviorally try and manage a warm day. And you'll see that they splay out kind of starfishy so that, they have as much, their whole stomach, for example, is right against the cooler snow or ice or ground, whatever it is that they have close to them that is coolest. So they will try to cool down. You'll also see if you have bears that are play fighting, which we see sometimes, you'll see that every so often they'll take a break, they'll lie down like I was describing, and they'll also maybe eat a little bit of snow if it's available to them. And that's also to cool down. So, I mean, there are some behavioral actions that they can take to cool down, but that's not adaptation per se.
We're going to touch on something that you just mentioned as well, Tia, in your response. You mentioned whether you're seeing a polar bear in the wild or perhaps in a zoo and aquarium setting. And Mr. Crotty's class would like to know from a student, Isabella, are polar bears in zoo exhibits because they are endangered and they're trying to protect them, or because they've been rescued from the wild, or why might we see polar bears in zoos?
Right. So there are a few polar bears that come from the wild, so to speak, like a refuge. For example, there are orphan cubs that have been taken to refuges, but that's quite rare. Almost every polar bear that you will ever see in the zoo was born in a zoo, right? So it's this, we call it a captive population, and they don't come in from the wild. Like they're not caught in the wild anymore. And what they do is they are acting as ambassadors for their species, you could call it. They're inspiring people to take action on climate change and to learn and be fascinated about polar bears, right? They're also actually helping us learn a lot about polar bears because there are some places where we do research with polar bears. Now, when researchers have a polar bear in hand in the wild, we typically only see that bear that one time, that 1 year. We may never see this particular bear again. So the information we get from this bear is only from that one point in time. And that makes it a little bit difficult sometimes to interpret the data that we get from that bear. And that's why polar bears in zoos are really, really important to polar bear conservation. So polar bears in zoos are really important to protecting polar bears in the wild, because polar bears in zoos, we can get access to those same bears every day if need be. And we can take a hair sample, for example, from them every day, right? And with that, then we have information that covers a much longer period. It can even be a whole calendar year. And having that information, that broad scale information, helps us interpret what we got from that one wild bear that one day, right? So polar bears in zoos, they're doing a lot of work for their wild peers.
Thank you, Tia. You mentioned that we can learn a lot from polar bears in zoos and that they act as ambassadors for their wild cousins. And, we know that polar bears in zoos can help us, for instance, learn more about how polar bears might respond to continued diminished sea ice habitat. But I want to touch on the other point that you made, that polar bears can act as ambassadors for polar bears in the wild. And so we have a question, an anonymous question, and somebody is wondering, how long will it take if we continue like this, business as usual with our carbon emissions? How long will it take for polar bears to go extinct?
Yeah, that's a pretty heavy question, and again, that's one that hopefully we've done a lot of research about that. It's something that is on the mind of every single polar bear researcher out there. I know Tia's working on that. I've worked on that, learning more and more about how climate change is affecting polar bears. A really important piece of research came out this year with some people that actually work with PBI, with Steve Amstrup and some other scientists. And they showed that if we don't change things, if we continue with business as usual, some of the more affected polar bear populations will be completely wiped out by the end of the century. And that really we're just going to have polar bears in some of these locations in the high Canadian Arctic where there'll still be sea ice for them. So things are pretty grim for polar bears, and it's a really scary time for them. It's a scary time to be a polar bear researcher because these are animals that we really love and that we've come to be really passionate about. And we are seeing this kind of research come out that shows that their time is really limited. And I'm sure Tia probably has more that she can expound on that. She's been working with polar bears much longer than me, but yeah, as far as how long they're going to be around, we talked, or I don't think we have mentioned this yet, but there's 19 subpopulations of polar bears around the world. Some of those subpopulations are much more threatened than others, and those ones that are more threatened, if things don't change, we are going to lose within our lifetimes, and if not that, by the end of the century.
Thank you, Wes. On that note, Miss Lawrence's class, a third grade class in Ontario, is wondering, how we can help polar bears. And I think it's important to reiterate that the key to getting the climate system back to functioning the way it should and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic is to move away from fossil fuels for energy altogether. And in the meantime, we can also take steps to use much, much less of the kinds of energy that add heat trapping gases to our atmosphere. And so for different people, that means different things, but it's important to look outside our own households and into our community about how we can affect change, whether that's in our classrooms, in our schools, in the places that we work, the places that we play, community centers. And, I think for youth, a great way to plug in and make a difference is for you to become the teacher. Do the adults in your life know where the energy in your homes or your schools or the other buildings that you're in come from? Does it come from polar bear friendly sources like solar, wind, or water? And then, ask the adults, can we switch? And how do we go about doing that? Follow your curiosity and imagine a world without those energy sources that trap too much heat around our planet. And what does that look like? Investigate how we might get there and continue to learn and get there for polar bears. Let's switch gears also. We're gonna totally go back to some of the ways that polar bears live in the wild amongst atop of the sea ice. And we've got someone who wants to know, Cosmic Bear would like to know, do polar bears stay together? Do they live in groups or packs like wolves? Or do they live alone?
So polar bears are quite solitary most of the year. The exceptions to that are, of course, is mating season, which is in the spring. And then it's when the female has cubs. She will be with her cubs for 2.5 years. So you can't really call them solitary during those periods of time. Sometimes bears will also tolerate being close to each other. I don't think they're having fun hanging out, but they'll tolerate other bears being close by. For example, if there is a beached whale carcass, and there's food enough for everyone, then they will tolerate being together with other bears. But other than that, they're mostly solitary. Yeah, you have to keep in mind, though, that polar bears have a brilliant sense of smell. So even if you and I were out on the sea ice and looking around and we didn't see any polar bears, if it was a polar bear standing in that same spot looking around, it may not be able to see other polar bears, but perhaps it would still smell them, right? So yeah, it depends on how you define solitary, but they mostly just hang out on their own.
Yeah, which is true for most, like all of the bears actually, and some of the cubs will stay with their moms less time or more time for the different species of bears, but pretty much any bear that you're ever going to see out there, it's going to be on its own most of its life unless it's a mom with cubs.
Wes, are you able to tell us a little bit more about moms and cubs and how many cubs can one polar bear have in their lifetime? How long, like you mentioned, do they stay with their mom? Is there anything that you'd like to share with everyone today?
So one of my favorite things, and this is kind of the beginning of that whole cycle that has to deal with cubs, is this thing called delayed implantation. So essentially what happens with almost all bear species again is that you'll have the male and the female, when they mate, instead of that egg instantly becoming fertilized, it's going to fertilize, but then it's going to hang out before it implants on the uterus wall, and it's going to just kind of essentially chill. I'm trying to dumb this down a little bit, but it's going to hang out in the mom's body until her body knows that she is healthy enough to have a cub. And when that happens, when she's fat enough, when she's eaten enough food, and she's ready to have to dig a den and have that cub, that egg is going to implant and it's going to start to grow, and then she's going to have her cubs in her den. And mama polar bears will usually have 1 to 2 cubs, but it's possible for them to have triplets as well. And those cubs are going to be born in December. They're going to be about 1 foot long when they're born. They're going to weigh about 1 pound. Like Tia mentioned earlier, they're going to have pink skin, hardly any fur. They don't have teeth. They're essentially blind, and they're going to be nursing on some really rich milk fat. The mom's milk fat is about 31%, so it's really rich. That's almost like drinking straight butter. And those cubs are nursing and they're growing, and by the time they leave their den in March or April, they weigh about 30 pounds. So they've gained a lot of weight just nursing on mom. And then they're going to play outside of those dens for a little while. They're going to get used to their new environment. The Arctic can be very cold still in March and April, so they're going to be outside playing with mom, learning how to be a polar bear. And once mom realizes that those cubs are strong enough, she's then going to lead them out to the sea ice, where they're going to learn how to hunt seals. They're going to learn how to be a polar bear, and they're going to grow up with mom. And at about 2.5 years of age, they're actually going to be weaned off of mom, which means they're going to leave her. They're going to go out and start their own lives as polar bears. And by then, they'll have all the skills that they need to survive in the Arctic. So it's a really beautiful thing. It's one of my favorite things about bears. It's just how great their moms are, how good of a job they do taking care of their cubs, and then this really kind of special, vulnerable time when they're all surviving together out there on the sea ice.
Thanks, Wes. We do know that all moms want, a healthy future for their cubs, and that is beautiful. Yeah. So in regards to moms and cubs, we have a question from Mrs. Lloyd's 4th grade class in Atlanta, and they would like to know, how do polar bears make their dens? And I have an additional question towards that. I know that we have these biofacts here. I'm wondering if Tia, if you might be able to tell everyone here more about a polar bear claw and what they might use them for, and then also how polar bears make their den.
All right. So I actually think that Wes would be the one to ask about the dens, unless I'm completely wrong here.
That's
Take it away, Wes.
Yeah. So polar bears, what they'll do is they'll look for any kind of like raised ground. So they used to den mostly out on the sea ice, but anymore as the sea ice becomes less and less stable for them, they're coming on shore, and so they're looking for like coastal bluffs. They're looking for river bluffs, pretty much any kind of raised ground where a snowdrift might accumulate. So when the snow blows into that raised area, the polar bear will look for just the right area, and she'll start digging into that snow. And in some parts of the world, like Churchill, they'll even look for peat, which is like a kind of a mossy soil that they can also dig into. But most of the places in the world where you find polar bears, they're going to dig into snowdrifts. They use those claws that you just showed, Marisa, to dig in there. And they carve out an area that's just big enough for their bodies, just big enough for them to be able to turn around in. And after they do that, the mom will simply wait in there, and she lets the snow cover that snow den. So when you're looking for polar bear dens, you're essentially just looking at snowdrifts. And that was my job. I went out and actually tried to find these dens. And they're incredibly hard to find because the mom is completely enclosed in that snow. So you just see these snowdrifts, you know kind of the amount of snow that they need to den in and the areas that they're looking for. And then you can use some different technology to actually find the bears within those dens. But yeah, essentially she's just digging a hole in the snow, letting it snow over top of her, and then she's going to have the cubs in that little snow cave.
Great, thanks, Wes.
Yeah.
I see, Tia, I saw you get up there and go back to your bookshelf of goodies back there. Did you have anything that you wanted to share with everyone?
Yeah, no, I think you also had a claw to show people, but I just wanted to do this one up close. So this is a replica, but this is how a polar bear claw looks. And you can see that it's roughly the size of my thumb. So it's like 5 or 6 centimeters, this particular claw. And it's quite short, really, if you compare to other bear species. And it's not just short, it's also incredibly sharp. Because, yes, polar bears can dig in the snow, but they don't really use their claws for that. That's more like that whole dinner plate-sized paw that will do that kind of work. These claws, what they are really good at is grabbing onto a seal. Seals can be wet and slippery. So with these claws, they'll grab onto the seal and drag them out of the water onto the sea ice.
Awesome. So we know that polar bears live, they're built to live on top of the sea ice. And we know that there's 19 designated subpopulations of polar bears, as Wes mentioned previously. We have a question from a 3rd grade class in St. Thomas, Waterdown, Ontario, and they would like to know which country has the most polar bears, and is there any place that polar bears cannot live?
Tia, do you want to field that one?
Sure. Just there are 5 countries where we have polar bears in the northern part of those countries. So one is Greenland, which is kind of sort of a part of Denmark. Then we have Canada. Then we have the US, only in Alaska. Then we have the enormous coastline of Russia. And then we have this group of islands called Spitsbergen or Svalbard, which is a part of Norway. So those are the 5 polar bear countries, right? And actually, even though there are 5 polar bear countries, 2/3 of the world's polar bears are found in Canada. So Canada has by far the most polar bears. Yeah, and polar bears, I mean, they need that sea ice to live. So if you don't have any sea ice, you're not going to have any polar bears, right? So that really sets a limit for where they can live in the wild. I don't know if you have anything to add. Oh, sorry.
Well, while you're at, if you have anything to add, Wes, that's great also. And then perhaps you can also answer how many polar bears, that are living in these different populations, how many polar bears are there total on Earth?
Yeah, adding to what Tia said, they're a really hard animal to count because they do travel these huge distances between they go out on the sea ice and they can really wander and go really far. And then another thing she mentioned that I think is really important to note is that Russia has this extensive coastline, and it's so long, and there's been a bit of a lack of information from some of those areas. So we're not totally sure how many polar bears are in Russia and in some of these other areas where they're really hard to get to. As you can imagine, going way out on the Arctic sea ice is pretty hard. It's hard to get out there. It's hard to spend a lot of time out there. So it's hard to get a really accurate count. But we do estimate there's somewhere around 25,000 polar bears in the wild. That count, you know, depending on who you ask, it can be a little bit more or a little bit less than that. But it is really tricky to get a really accurate count of polar bears just because their range is so large and because they live in really, really, really remote places.
Thank you. And in those regions that, you know, polar bears cannot live, or as they come up to regions closer and closer where another species sort of fulfills that niche, somebody has a question from Eaton School, and they would like to know if you could talk a little bit about grizzlies and polar bears coming together and what that might mean for evolution and adaptation.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Tia, if I talk a little bit about this.
Not at all. I was going to send it your way.
Yeah, so actually the area that I worked in Alaska, there's an annual whale hunt. So the indigenous people up there are allowed to harvest a number of whales. And sometimes after they kill those whales and they take the parts of the whales that they want, the bears are allowed to then come in on those carcasses and feed on the carcasses. And as climate change increases, we're seeing brown bears or grizzly bears move further north, and the polar bears are sharing more and more space with them. And those whale carcasses, there's a place where we see a lot of interaction because it's such a great food source. So you'll see grizzly bears come in on a whale carcass that already has polar bears on them. And a lot of times those grizzly bears are so aggressive that they can even run the polar bears off of a whale carcass. So often the grizzlies will be the first ones to feed, and the polar bears will actually wait patiently until the grizzlies are done and then come in and feed, or they'll feed at the same time. And sometimes in those interactions, we do see some breeding. And typically that involves a male grizzly and a female polar bear, and they end up having a hybrid bear, which we call a growler bear, or sometimes they're called pizzly bears. I prefer growler, but you know, you can go with what you want. And that's really rare. That doesn't happen that often. And we don't know too much about those hybrid animals, but it is something that's happening, and they do share some space in different parts of their range.
Thank you, Wes. You actually sort of touched on then one of Miss Zeke's class's questions about polar bears eating whales, but their other question, and I'll pass it to you, Tia, for this if you don't mind, is do polar bears drink water?
So the answer is yes, but also no. So polar bears actually, we all know that polar bears love to eat seal, right? But they particularly love to eat seal fat or seal blubber. And that's because when they've eaten that blubber, once that's broken down, once it's metabolized inside of their body, it actually releases water. It sounds like magic, but it's a very natural process, right? So polar bears, if they're lucky enough, they're good enough hunters and they get all the seals and all the seal fat that they want, they don't actually necessarily need to drink water, right? However, if they do need to drink water, then during the summertime in the high Arctic, if you're out looking at the sea ice, you'll see in the areas where it still is in the middle of the summer, you'll see that there are these meltwater pools forming on top of the sea ice. And that's actually fresh water because the salt is being forced out of the ice as it freezes. So it's fresh water that's, you know, just lying there on top of some of the ice flows in these little pools. And then the bears can, of course, drink that, or they can take a mouthful of snow or ice if there's anything available to them.
Thank you, Tia. And we're getting to a quarter to the hour here, and so we'll have time for a couple more questions. But while we're on the topic of water, let's switch gears to the seawater, the water in which polar bears swim. And Van would like to know, how well do polar bears swim? And the Eaton School would like to know, how long can polar bears stay under the water?
Yeah, maybe I can answer the first half of that, and Tia can answer the second half. They swim really well. Tia already mentioned that they have really big paws. I mean, their paws are essentially paddles. So they just get in the water and they use those paws for swimming. And it's like having, just big old, essentially paddles on your hand. There's a photo for you guys. And they can swim really well. They swim at about 6 miles per hour. And their name literally means maritime bear. They spend a lot of time in and out of the water as they're hunting seals, as they're navigating the Arctic. So it's a really comfortable environment for them.
Yeah.
Were you able to go for it?
Yep. So the longest swim underwater, the longest dive, if you will, that we know of that's been documented with polar bears was a polar bear that was out hunting, trying to catch seals along the edge of an ice floe, and it actually was submerged for 3 minutes and 10 seconds. So we know for sure that that's how long polar bears can hold their breath. It's probably longer, I would guess. But this particular bear, at the end of that dive, decided to go up and try and get one of the seals that was lying on the ice floe. So it didn't want to stay underwater anymore because there was a potential meal right there.
Great. Now, if we're not seeing polar bears in the water because they've living a life upon the sea ice, if we happen to come across a polar bear on land, Miss Joy's class in Richmond Hill, Canada would like to know, are polar bears dangerous and how can people keep themselves safe in polar bear country?
So my short answer, and Wes, I'll let you follow up with this, but my short answer is keep a lookout. Keep a lookout all the time. Yeah, even if you don't think there's a bear nearby, keep a lookout. Yeah, it doesn't make for quite as heroic stories. You're not going to have any close encounters, but it's the best way to prevent anyone from getting harmed, whether it's the bear or whether it's humans, right? Keep a lookout and, be ready.
Yeah, and touching on, the first part of that question, are they dangerous? Polar bears have this reputation of being man-eaters and being really dangerous, and I think they get that reputation because they are the only bear species that's purely carnivorous. So while a lot of the other bears are going to be eating lots of plants and kind of grazing, polar bears are just really eating other animals, and so they have this reputation of being this ultimate predator, but they don't really see us as a food source. They don't really see us as a potential thing that they want to eat. So they don't really deserve that reputation of these man-eaters. If they really were trying to eat people, there'd be a lot more polar bear attacks than there actually are, a lot. But there really aren't that many. It's pretty rare that they ever do attack people, but they do have the potential to do it. And they are a huge animal and one that you definitely don't want to be attacked by. So I just want to echo what Tia said and just say that the best offense is a good defense. So you just want to be really prepared. You want to have a lookout. You want to carry bear spray if you're in a country where you're allowed to carry it. And just be as careful as you can if you're in a place where you might see polar bears.
It's great to know that there are ways that we can keep polar bears and people safe. In regards to polar bears encountering other polar bears, we've got a question. Somebody would like to know, do polar bears fight? Do they play fight when they come into contact with each other? Is that something either of you have seen in the wild?
Personally, I haven't seen it, but I'm sure Tia has, so I'm going to let her answer that one.
Yeah, so the real fighting, which happens during mating season in the spring, usually takes place way out on the sea ice. And I think few people have actually been lucky enough to see that. But that's where, the male bears will really go for it and often actually hurt each other in the process of, trying to get to the female and secure the female for themselves. The play fighting or the fighting that I've seen is the play fighting. And I've seen that on the tundra outside of Churchill in Canada, because there you have a lot of bears just hanging out and they're probably bored and they don't have any food. So there's nothing to fight about. They don't have any food, and it's outside of mating season, so there's nothing really to fight over, right? However, the young bears, they seem to take this as an opportunity to like practice their moves, right? For when it actually counts. So they will be play fighting or sparring, as we call it, which really is just a milder version of what they will eventually do come springtime. It looks like I wouldn't want to get in the middle of it, but it looks like they're having fun doing it, right?
Great, thank you, Tia. So while we're about to wrap up here, and as we mentioned previously, the focus of International Polar Bear Day is protecting denning mothers and their cubs. We're going to take one more question from the Visitation BVM School outside of Philadelphia, and these are fourth graders. And they would like to know, when cubs leave their moms, will they see them again?
That's a good question. So we don't actually know the answer to that, but, and Wes, you can follow up on this. I'm sure you have stuff to add. Research has shown that female cubs sometimes will end up denning really close to the area where their mom was denning when she had them. And so, you know, there may be that the mom and her female cubs, they may end up in that same area, but we don't know for sure, right? And we also don't really know how they recognize each other. I'm sure they have some way of doing it, but we don't actually know how they recognize each other. So yeah, the answer is, for me, is maybe they would see each other again, but chances are slim because, as we already talked about, polar bears really roam far and wide. I don't know,
Great,
Wes,
thank
if you have
you.
anything to add to that.
I think Wes, as our panelists here have a lot of demands on their time, I think Wes had to jump off for another commitment that he had today as well. But I know that he was super excited to share this time with everyone today. So Tia, I'm actually hoping, you know, Tia did an amazing connection the other day, and with her wealth of resources behind her with her books, she shared some of her favorite polar bear books. And one of those was geared towards a youth-based audience. And I'm just hoping that maybe you would like to share one of those resources with everyone today, and then we'll close it out.
Sure, I can do that. Hang on, I need to find it again. I am guessing that you are thinking of this one.
Yeah.
Correct? All right. So this is actually a graphic novel or a comic book called Science Comics Polar Bears. And I was a consultant on this, as was Ian Sterling, one of the grand old masters of polar bear research. So I assure you that everything in here is scientifically correct. And also, it's pretty hilarious, to be honest. So I would definitely recommend this one. Like, it has, yeah, if you go online, you can take a look inside, see if it's anything for you, but I really enjoy it.
Thanks, Tia. What a great way to continue to learn about polar bears, incorporate art and reading, and all the things that we love to do. And so I'm going to close us out here for the day. And I'd just like to say thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We hope that you learned something new about polar bears. I want to thank Wes Larson and Tia Beckshoff for joining. I know everyone seems to be busy more than ever these days somehow. And I'd also like to thank our team in the background that you don't get a chance to see, but KT, Emma, and Elisa, who are helping to run the technology, get your questions to us, and share some of these amazing pictures and video assets that we have. If you enjoyed learning today, be sure to ask an adult for permission. And you can tune in tomorrow to our website and social media for a craft on International Polar Bear Day, and you can make a polar bear out of recycled materials from your home. So bring your creativity and your imagination and join us for some fun. And then absolutely stay tuned for more of these live events for our Spring Tundra Connections program. And as I said before, if you're continuing to spend more time in virtual learning and sheltering at home, be sure to check out our discussion topics on Flipgrid. for more about polar bears and protecting the habitats that people and polar bears depend on. And as always, we want to thank our partners at Flipgrid and Microsoft Education and explore.org for making live connections like this possible. Explore.org is a great way to follow your curiosity around the globe through their website and live cams. And whether you want to learn or just chill out with their live cams, and this winter you can chill out watching the Northern Lights cam. Thank you again to our sponsors and panelists. And lastly, I want to thank all of you learners, all of you educators out there. We are really experiencing a time that will be marked in history. And I just want to say that all of us at Polar Bears International, we think that you are doing the impossible this year and you are doing an amazing job. So keep it up. We're going to say farewell today and share a closing video. And until next time. There we go. Thanks, KT.
Future generations of people and polar bears depend on the decisions and plans that we make today. The key to getting the climate back to functioning the way it should and to preserving a future for polar bears across the Arctic is to move away from using fossil fuels for energy altogether. The most important thing we can do is vote with the climate in mind to let our leaders know we support a swift transition to renewable energy sources. In the meantime, we can directly participate in and learn more about our local and regional renewable energy options. We can all make a difference outside our own households by influencing where our energy comes from. We hope you leave here feeling inspired and return home to leverage your voice and your influence. Because together, we can make sure that polar bears roam the Arctic sea ice for generations to come.